Thank you for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. Um, Even though if it's somewhat embarrassing for me to give an introduction in front of so many intelligent people, it reminds me of this worldly wisdom. Remember, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only painful for others. And the same applies when you're stupid. To be on the safe side, I could, of course, run through a list of trends that are having an impact on the present and probably also on the future. I will only cite five. The rise of China, of course, that has been said, does a shift in economic and political power towards Asia. Probably the most significant trend of all right now. Second, the end of Pax Americana, USA's retreat around the world in terms of ensuring security and order, and the consequences for an at times undecided and perplexed Europe. Third, the tremendous technological developments, particularly in the field of digitalization, with profound political implications. Consider the problems in terms of cybersecurity or in regulating social media, artificial intelligence, or the Internet of Things. I could mention a huge challenge in the form of climate change and what that means in political and economic terms. 2021 saw the second highest levels of CO2 emissions ever, despite the COVID crisis. The 7 warmest years since records began have been the last 7 years. And finally, global demographics and immigration. 9 of 10 people in sub-Saharan Africa had not yet been born when the Berlin Wall came down. 40% of that young population have access to a 4G mobile phone. They can see how things are in the West. And if there are problems in their own country, they will try their luck elsewhere. I could continue by speculating about current developments such as rising inflation, the events along the Russian-Ukrainian border, or about the impact of China's zero-COVID strategy on globalization, about the massive levels of private and state debt amassed in recent years, and the list goes on. But you are all aware of these points, and this is what we read about elsewhere and all the time. Let me therefore take a step back and share with you 3 somewhat more personal and more general observations. Firstly, we are pretty obsessed with the present. We talk about living in an era of unprecedented change. When a tennis player fails to obtain a visa, we are immensely excited and agitated. And our stress levels rise in the stock market when stock markets drop 0.5%. Perhaps we should talk less about the present day change, for it's really not always that huge. Instead, we should focus on the change that perhaps lies ahead. When we look back, we see that the generations living through the 100 years before us witnessed at least as much change as we are seeing it today. In 2 weeks' time, Queen Elizabeth II will celebrate the 70th anniversary of her coronation. Quite a lot has happened during her reign. In her first year, the UK tested an atomic bomb for the first time in Australia. Up until then, until the USA and Russia had nuclear weapons. In the same year, the USA tested the hydrogen bomb for the first time. Everyone wanted an atomic bomb back then. 6 years later, in 1958, even the Swiss government published a press release in which it claimed the country's neutrality would have to be defended with nuclear weapons. As an aside, if you were to ask the media today, you would get the impression that the matter of nuclear proliferation is under control. I'm not quite so sure. The European coal and steel community was founded in 1952. An assassination attempt was carried out on Chancellor Adenauer, and Stalin was preparing a fresh purge. Sputnik had not yet orbited the Earth, let alone Apollo 11 circling the moon. There had not yet been an oil crisis, the internet hadn't been invented, and hardly anyone spoke of global warming. The notion that smoking could be bad for your health was not even an issue in 1952. So change is relative. We have a tendency to ignore the past, overestimate the present, and underestimate the long-term future. For many of us, the future is simply a steady continuation of the present. But that is not necessarily the case. Things can get dangerous if unpalatable negative scenarios are suppressed, and if the only acceptable truth is what people want to hear. So it is a worthy task of a think tank to draw attention to such scenarios too. Secondly, if there is one area in which unprecedented change is taking place, it is in the area of science and technology. And some areas of technologies are rather beyond us. We need to be careful. To go back to Queen Elizabeth II, at her time of coronation, the best computer in the world was a 27-ton beast with over 17,000 electron tubes, 70,000 resistors, and 10,000 capacitors. It was so fault-prone that it couldn't be turned off, otherwise the tube was liable to blow, diminishing the computer's performance. The machine took up an area of 167 square meters and had a memory of around 100 bytes. Today, TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, produces semiconductors the size of a few nanometers. In the 1980s, it took 4 years to sequence the genome of the HIV virus. To sequence the coronavirus at the end of 2019, it took scientists a mere week. If you had told someone 30 years ago what we can do today with CRISPR technology, or that through machine learning, we can predict pretty accurately how proteins fold in a water solution, one of the most complex and important questions in biology and medicine, no one would have believed you. And yet, at the same time, we don't even understand how the technology that we use daily actually works. We are increasingly and ever more successfully making use of artificial intelligence without understanding what's going on. Politicians face the challenge of trying to regulate technologies over which they no longer have an overview. The result is growing public distrust. Instead of having a nuanced, fact-based discussion about the risks and the opportunities of new technologies, incredible, in the literal sense, incredible conspiracy theories are propagated. Instead of evidence-based policy, we get policy-based evidence. More and more people are becoming irritable or aggressive. The corona pandemic has clearly highlighted a divide between science and politics. I consider this relationship to be one of the great challenges of our time. Maybe think tanks can find a way of helping to encourage greater mutual understanding and so prevent further polarization within society. Thirdly, international developments in recent years have shown that democracy is not a given. It is often hard won and something that must be defended, or else it will crumble. What is surprising from a Swiss perspective is how often democracy is confused with holding an election every 4 years. Democracy is so much more than that. You know, 200 or 300 years ago, Switzerland was neither wealthy nor particularly peaceful. In fact, we frequently used to skirmish. And when Tolstoy, who wasn't exactly a city dweller, visited Switzerland, he was shocked by the poverty, misery, and hardship he came across. For us, democracy presented a means of living together in peace, but it took many years to get there, to establish a constitutional state, put in place a social safety net, develop an education system, protect minorities, etc. A democracy is based on a whole series of conditions that it cannot create itself, and it is continually in precarious equilibrium. Maybe you know the wonderful book by Antonio Scorati, M, Il figlio del secolo, Son of the Century, that was published a few years ago. It's a book about Benito Mussolini in the period between the First World War and when the fascists seized power. Scorati impressively describes how an authoritarian movement can arise out of the lack of prospects for the returning soldiers, out of economic misery, and out of despair. The book was a bestseller in Italy because many readers realized that it wasn't in fact about the period after the First World War, but the present day. It's not about Mussolini, but about Salvini. And it's about how the public can be seduced by very simple remedies to complex problems. I am a mathematician and physicist by education, and the mathematicians amongst you are certainly familiar with the British number theorist Alfred North Whitehead, who once said, "The guiding motto in the life of every natural philosopher should be, seek simplicity and distrust it. There are no whole truths. All truths are half truths. It's trying to treat them as whole truths that plays the devil." That could well serve as a guiding principle for many think tanks. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that think tanks, at least those that place the think above the tank, are an incredibly useful invention because they question prevailing views and political assertions, and because they can present an outside view that may not be popular, but that is nevertheless justified. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "Patriotism is fundamentally a conviction that a particular country is the best in the world because you were born in it." I perhaps wouldn't go quite that far, but you always have to be careful that you don't confuse your own perspective with the truth. Think tanks are valuable, but think tanks are not elected. Their staff observe, analyze, think a lot, write and make proposals, and that is a very demanding and important work, but they do not experience the burden and responsibility of executive office holders today, at least if they are doing their job properly. You're certainly aware or familiar with the saying, "Before you criticize a man, walk a mile in his shoes." And you probably also know the follow-up line by Steve Martin, because that way, when you criticize him, you'll be a mile away and you have his shoes. By that, I just want to say your work is important. Setting out the facts, analyzing them, placing them in a geopolitical and historical context is very important. But even more important is exercising wisdom, circumspection, and caution in your verdicts and assessment. On that note, I hope you have a successful and stimulating summit. And now I will observe the wise words that my mother used to tell me: never miss a good opportunity to shut up. Thank you very much, Peter.